Hi there, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews. This is episode 39. We're going to start today with a question from Evelyn from Canada, who says, how does long-term alcoholism affect brain function?
It affects it very badly. It affects it disastrously. Long-term alcohol use damages all sorts of outposts in the brain. But right off the bat, we first have to see there's three different domains of alcohol damage to the brain. The first one is you get damage because you wipe out your liver, and that causes all sorts of secondary problems. We're going to ignore that. We're also going to ignore the fact that alcoholics often have lousy nutrition. And what that often involves is a shortage in particular of vitamin thiamine. And turns out when you got a thiamine deficiency, that causes damage in the brain itself, in a part of the brain called the medial dorsal thalamus, which was the very first part of the brain I ever studied when I was in college. And it causes something called a Wernicke-Korsakoff's dementia. So rule those out. So make sure your liver's okay and you're getting great nutrition. And then let's simply explore what's alcohol doing to your brain. And there's all sorts of ways of looking at it. Alcohol can be pro-inflammatory in the brain. Alcohol is known to decrease the amount of gray matter in the brain, which is the cell bodies of your neurons. Even more so, it decreases the white matter, which are the long cables, the myelinated cables of axons and dendrites by which neurons are talking to each other. Okay, so it's laying waste there. It's causing all sorts of problems, inflammation, you're losing stuff. There's some evidence that certain neurotransmitter systems are more vulnerable than others. The neurotransmitter GABA comes up a lot. So all of that's great and interesting. But on the most fundamental level, if we switch now to a little bit of chemistry, what is alcohol? Alcohol is ethanol. Here is ethanol. Here's the chemical structure for ethanol. And I show it there, and it's got two carbons and an oxygen and a bunch of hydrogens in there. And this is the damaging compound. And the thing about it is, this is a really simple compound. This is a very small one, just to give you a sense of what we're talking with in terms of substances of abuse. Here's the chemical structure of heroin. And up there on the right, same size, tiny little ethanol, much, much smaller, much simpler. Or to really hammer this home, here we have the chemical structure of one of the opioids. Let's see, there we go. One of the opioids out there. And you could see in the tiny little box there, that's ethanol in comparison. It's a tiny molecule, which is to say it does something really non-specific all over the body. Cell biology, back to ninth grade biology. You got your cell, it's round, it's got the nucleus in there, it's got the required by law powerhouse of the cell, mitochondria drawn in there, and it's got the membrane around it, which is where ethanol comes in. Looking at the membrane closely, you see one of the great iconic images of the last century of science, the lipid bilayer up on top. When you look at the membrane, it's actually made of two layers of outward facing molecules that like water and inward facing molecules that are hydrophobic, that don't like it. And this is what your membrane is made of. And you can see bits of its three dimensionality there. So that's your basic membrane. In reality, though, it is vastly more complicated because embedded in your membrane, embedded in there, are all sorts of receptors and channels and enzymes and things like that. In other words, all sorts of stuff that is pretty critical for your cell to be doing its normal functioning, to respond to hormones, to respond to neurotransmitters, to secrete stuff, to take up energy, glucose. So, what does ethanol do? Ethanol term is it intercalates, it gets into the lipid bilayer and it gets in between the two layers of it. And as a result, jargon, it fluidizes your membrane. And as a result, all sorts of stuff that's anchored in there, receptors that are anchored to channels or the two halves of some pump and all of that just floats laterally. All of it can just slip around all over the place. And in the most non-specific sort of way, you got all your stuff in your membrane that are supposed to be forming complexes of working together, and they're just sliding away and they're not making sense. And like, why does that get you brain damage? And here we have the sort of message you might get here. Do not drink this. Do not drink this. It is poisonous. And what we've done is we have allowed lateral flow across the membrane of this sentence. I've held every third letter constant, and the intervening two, I used a random number generator and let them float around any which way. And as you can see, you are up the creek if you really need to get this message not to drink this stuff because it's poisonous. Nothing makes sense. Everything is chaotic. All of your neurons are functioning abnormally. And the fact that there's subsets of neurons related to memory, related to emotion regulation, impulse control, that those are some of the ones that get dysfunctional most quickly, reflects the fact that those are some of the more expensive ones. Just basically on like this very reductive, atomistic, you're getting this tiny little ethanol molecule and it's getting all into the membrane, and your membranes stop making sense and stop functioning. And when that happens, your neurons are not long for this world, and your brain function is not long for this world. Okay, final issue with this. This is typically where the bargaining starts. Okay, so chronic alcoholism, lipidizes, it fluidizes all your membranes in your brain, and you're a mess then, and it's vitamin deficiency, and your liver dies, and everything's going wrong. What about like everyday moderate alcohol consumption? And the dogma in the field used to be not only is it okay, a moderate amount, and somehow it's always red wine or white wine or something innocuous and elitist like that. Somehow it's always just a little moderate amount of it. Not only isn't bad for you, it's good for you. This was sort of dogma in the field that a little bit of alcohol on a regular basis is good for you. It's good for your cardiovascular system. From the very start, I was suspicious of that literature, somehow assuming it was all paid for by wine manufacturers. But eventually, a far more meaningful problem with that literature came out. So let's think about, you want to study this. You want to see if there's any health benefits to people who have, a couple of glasses of wine per evening. So you look at them, and what's your control group have to be? People who have not drunk any alcohol for the last year, for the last 5 years, some such thing. Who are these people going to be? There's not a lot of people out there who have not drunk any alcohol at all in the last 5 years. Who are you likely to get in your control group? People who have stopped drinking in the last year, the last 5 years, the last decade, whatever, have entirely stopped, almost certainly because they were drinking way in excess before that. And to the point that their loved ones, everyone finally got through to them saying, you got to stop, you got to swear off alcohol. This is not comparison of moderate drinkers with non-drinkers. This is de facto slipping in there under the radar, a comparison of moderate drinkers with people who used to be either full-blown alcoholics or at least teetering in the neighborhood of. And when you do that comparison, oh, big surprise, the moderate drinkers have a healthier cardiovascular system because these people were pickling their blood vessels for years and years. That entire literature is erroneous, is confounded. For that reason, when you look closely at the well-done studies, there is no threshold effect. It's not even, there's a domain in which alcohol is protective and then it stops being. There's not even a domain in which it is benign and neutral. Every bit of this weird ethanol molecule you put into your brain is bad for your brain. So I'm getting all preachy here, and let's bring back prohibition, except that'll get us like Al Capone and Meyer Lansky and Joe Kennedy again. So that may not be a good idea. Like, there's no degree of safe alcohol consumption. It could be a little bit damaging. Yeah, a little bit is a little bit damaging, but it is damaging. And it does it in this remarkably like mindless fundamental way of it makes the membranes in your neurons all screwed up and dysfunctional. So that's my vote. I've already said this. I've never had a sip of alcohol in my life. It's not great for you. So some of the ways in which it does that involves this membrane fluidizing.
Next, Jim from Idaho says, you seem to poo poo Sigmund Freud, but doesn't his idea of determinism, that we are shaped by our childhood, both by parents and culture, closely match your own idea that we have no free will?
Well, a little bit. First off, I poo-poo a lot about Freud, but I think he's wonderful in some domains. He had really insightful stuff to say about major depression, using jargon and lack of biological substrates that were the case a century ago. But nonetheless, he was great with that. But the basic Freudian song and dance that there are some near inevitabilities of the influence your parents are going to have on you. Yes, I'm completely in agreement with Freud, Jim, when it comes to saying that childhood matters. The sort of adult you get is very heavily shaped by your childhood. And in that regard, whether you are Freudian or you are a molecular epigeneticist or you're a Jesuit who does the whole give me the boy and I'll give you the man sort of thing. Yeah, there's like general broad agreement that early environment has a big effect forever after. Where do I begin to differ from Freud? First off, is I would say, yeah, early environment is important, but so are this morning's hormone levels. So are the ecological factors that gave rise to your family's culture. So are the traumatic events of previous months that caused neuroplastic. Yeah, that's one of the pieces. You got to look at everything from a second before to a million years before. And this is one sliver, a very important sliver. The other way in which I differ from Freud is amid us agreeing that childhood matters. There's not a whole overlap in terms of what features he thought about childhood mattered compared to what sort of seems relevant these days, which is, oh, if you grow up being convinced that, unconsciously or otherwise, your dad wants to castrate you, um, that's one way of thinking about childhood as an influence, or because you want to grow up and marry your dad and you hate your mother and you wish you had a penis and penis envy. I can't resist the Woody Allen line. If he's always liked the Freudian concept of penis envy, but didn't understand why it only had to be restricted to women. And yeah, yes, early life matters, all of that. The stuff that Freud thought mattered I think can be thought of as gibberish from a modern biological context.
So, for our next question, Jenny from Utah asks, what makes some people want to lick their plates and others not?
At last, at last, that question has arrived. Plate licking, licking your plate along with its less sung, unsung cousin, which is just running your finger over the plate and then licking it. What are they about? For decades, for centuries, people have been arguing whether that is an outcome of nature or nurture. And the most sophisticated views these days tell us no, it's neither. It's the magnificent, complex, nuanced, surprising interaction between nature and nurture determining who among us lick plates and who don't. Beyond that, I have no idea at all, other than just to say, Jenny, this is getting posted the day before Thanksgiving. So I hope you and your loved ones have an interesting time discussing this at dinner tomorrow night. Beyond that, I don't know about plate licking.
My theory is it depends on whether you grew up with penis envy or not. Finally, Kevin from Ireland says, what do you say to someone who finds it unbearably disempowering to think A, that we lack free will, and B, that after some kind of kindling process, depression just like kind of comes at you sometimes?
Well, to take the second of those first, so you're finding it to be unbearably disempowering, the notion that sometimes depression just comes and gets you. Yeah. yet another of the gazillion versions of bad luck ambushed by fate, ambushed by neuropsychiatric fate. Yeah, that's pretty disempowering. That's pretty disempowering to know that there's all sorts of bad stuff that occurs in our heads we can't do anything about. Yes, I agree. In terms of feeling unbearably disempowered, bummed out, demoralized, depressed, etc., by the fact that we have no free will, at least for my 2 cents, my take obviously is very different at this point, in that I loudly will tell anyone who is not comatose that I think it's a great thing if everyone stops believing in free will. Okay, let us unpack the question from Kevin here, or some of the assumptions we could make. Kevin, no doubt for having sent this in, you've got a computer, you got electricity. I'm willing to guess you've got potable water. You've got all sorts of things going for you that you don't deserve, that you did not earn. In the same way that nothing about any of our intellectual or artistic or athletic or empathic skills are things that we earn. I have wonderfully comfy socks on right now, and I did not earn them. I desperately love your mother and glory in her loving me back with how wonderful, and I didn't earn it. I didn't earn any of that. I didn't earn the fact that when this is done, I can go and we've got a flush toilet here. I'm going to make use of it. We didn't earn any of this. We didn't earn any of this. None of this is anything we're entitled to in a world in which we are nothing more than the biological luck and its interactions with environmental luck that made us who we are at any given moment. Bummer, disempowering. And it's exactly at this point that one has to do, I think, a little bit of work to view that if you're sitting here and bummer, you don't get to lay claim to how wonderfully deserving you are of your comfy socks, your running water, or your food, or your any such thing. That means you're one of the lucky ones. In that disempowering winds up meaning you didn't really earn it. And the key thing is, for way too many people, disempowering means it turns out it's not your fault. Consider someone who was raised to think that they had it in their power to learn how to read as quickly, as adeptly as any of their other peers back in school back when, but they didn't, because they had it in their power to do otherwise, but they chose to be lazy, to be unmotivated. Or think about someone who believes that it has been in their power to simply curb their appetite because everybody else around them seems to do it. And instead, they just are succumbing to indulgence and are overweight. And do they secretly hate themselves? And that's why, or, you know, you could learn to be more social. You could be more socially skillful and extroverted and socially intelligent. You have the power to do that. And no, it turns out that maybe there's a reason why you can't. And in the first case, the disempowerment is no, you were not lazy and unmotivated. You got this thing called dyslexia, which means that the architecture of some part of your brain is screwy and you didn't have the power to be able to learn to read as quickly as your peers. Or oh, it's not just you're self indulgent and you secretly hate yourself, and that's why you overeat despite every third day saying how unhappy it makes you. And you, no, it turns out you got a gene variant in your hypothalamus of a protein there that is less sensitive to a food satiation signal. It can't turn off hunger like it does in most other people. Or you don't have friends, you're just off putting. Why am I such a weirdo? All of that. No, you got something called autism spectrum disorder, and there's a neurobiology of that. And you're really lousy at reading social cues, and you have trouble picking up, and you're off putting. And people think you're a weirdo, and you are functional enough amid that ASD spectrumy stuff to feel vast loneliness much of the time. And you didn't have the power to prevent that. And you didn't have the power to be really a loving faithful servant of God, and instead you went and you loved somebody of the same sex as you. In all of these cases, being disempowered is a great thing because it means it's not your damn fault. And you don't have to grow up hating yourself because you're stupid and never learned to read or spell well, or because you've got this off putting, unlikable personality, and thus you hate yourself, or because you're just a sinful offense to God because your love is going in all the wrong places, etc., etc. Framed this way, disempowerment is liberation. And this is good for at least two reasons why we should get over being bummed out that we didn't earn our comfy socks, which is when you look at it, first off, you're not having the endless examples out there of, say, a 40-year-old who could say, wow, yeah, I finally got a dyslexia diagnosis last year. I wish I could have gotten that when I was 8. I wish I didn't grow up hating myself for being this way, thinking it was my fault. So it is wonderfully liberating in that regard. And in a very practical sense, it's also great because you learn how things actually work. Whoa, people have now learned more effective teaching techniques to teach kids with dyslexia how to read. Ooh, people have learned how to design drugs like Ozempic, for example, which stimulates the food satiation pathways in the brain because we figured out that was not some like self-hatred and thus you want to eat yourself into unattractive. Nah, there's like some protein there that's not responsive enough. So let's really hit it with an oomph of this medication that gets, or you figure out that, like, here are social learning skills for someone on the autism spectrum where you can sort of pick up cues. But what happens when you get disempowered by recognizing there's no free will in these domains and it's not something you are responsible for, not something you are at fault for, and something you had no control over? For one thing, you stop feeling terrible about yourself, and it paves the way for science to figure out what is actually causing that stuff. And some of the time, the good outcome of that is teaching you, and don't go near any sorts of gibberish things that are supposed cures for these things that you supposedly have control over. And thus, the barbarity of like conversion therapy for gay men or whatever, so that God doesn't hate him anymore. All that happens when you accept that there's no free will, once you get past the fact that, I don't know, maybe you didn't earn the roof over your head, or the fact that you're a kind person and people appreciate that in you, or any of these other things. Once you get past that, getting rid of free will, disempowering in that sense, over and over and over, is liberating emotionally because it's not your fault. And from the scientific standpoint, at least as importantly, it's teaching you how things actually work so you can go and fix it.
And that's it for episode 39. Keep submitting questions at the form found in the Instagram story highlight and bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of Science and the Beard.